The night before his arrest, Jesus didn't pray in the language the Romans understood. He didn't pray in Latin. He didn't even pray in Aramaic, the language he spoke every day. He prayed in a language so old, so deliberately preserved, that the church that came after him spent 3 centuries trying to bury every manuscript that contained it. And inside those manuscripts, the ones they didn't manage to burn, there is a single phrase. 11 syllables, written in Coptic script. And according to the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, this phrase is described as the one utterance that the Archons, the rulers who feed on unconscious human energy, cannot process, cannot intercept, cannot use. You're going to hear it before this video ends. But first, I need to show you something that neuroscience only confirmed in the last 2 decades. Something the Gnostic Christians already knew 2,000 years ago about what happens to your mind at the exact moment you fall asleep. Because the phrase matters. But understanding why it works changes everything. In this video, you're going to discover first, what neuroscience found about the hypnagogic threshold, the 60-second window between waking and sleep, and why it's the most energetically vulnerable moment of your day. Second, what the Coptic manuscripts at Nag Hammadi actually say about the Archons, and how they extract what the texts call pneuma, the living breath, during unconscious sleep states. And third, the specific phrase that Jesus used in the Gospel of the Egyptians, written in its original script, and exactly how to use it. But before we get there, there's one thing I need to tell you about why you've never heard this before. Why this specific section of the Nag Hammadi library doesn't appear in any church lectionary, any seminary curriculum, any Sunday school anywhere in the world. That answer comes later, and it will make sense of something you've probably felt your whole life without being able to name it. In 2016, researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences published findings on what they called the hypnagogic state, the neurological transition between waking consciousness and sleep. What they found is not what the textbooks said. For decades, the assumption was that the brain simply powers down as you fall asleep, decreasing activity, decreasing coherence, decreasing signal, a gentle dimming. What the Max Planck data showed was the opposite. In the 60 to 90 seconds immediately preceding sleep onset, specific regions of the brain, particularly the default mode network and the right temporal lobe, actually spike in activity, not decrease. Spike. In some subjects, the neural firing patterns during this window exceeded what was measured during ordinary waking focus. The researchers described it as a threshold amplification event. The brain, in that moment, is not shutting off. It's opening. To what? That question got more specific in 2021 when a team at the University of Wisconsin Center for Sleep and Consciousness, led by Dr. Giulio Tononi, expanded on integrated information theory to model what the brain is actually receiving during this state. Their data suggested that the hypnagogic threshold reduces what they called discriminative filtering, the brain's normal gatekeeping against external signal contamination. In plain language, for about 60 seconds every night, the boundary between your internal processing and external signal becomes measurably thinner. Think of it this way. During the day, your brain is running a firewall. It's sorting, discarding, filtering. Millions of signals arrive, and almost all of them get rejected before they reach anything you'd call experience. Sleep drugs that firewall into lowering. That's why certain anesthetics and narcotics produce such disorienting experiences. But the hypnagogic state does something the anesthetics don't. It drops the firewall selectively. Higher frequencies, what researchers at MIT's Computational Neuroscience Lab have mapped as gamma oscillations above 40 Hz, pass through with almost no filtering during the 60-second threshold window. 40 Hz. That number is going to come back. What the science established, without meaning to, is that there is a precise 60-second window each night when your brain is maximally receptive to external pattern input and has almost no capacity to reject it. The Gnostics knew this. They just didn't call it gamma oscillations. They called it the hour of the Archons. In the Gospel of the Egyptians, not to be confused with the Gospel of Mark or any canonical text, there is a passage that, when translated directly from the Coptic, reads, "The rulers of the lower heavens wait at the threshold of each soul's nightly descent. It is there that they collect what the unguarded sleeper does not know he is giving." The Gospel of the Egyptians is one of the Nag Hammadi codices. It was written in Sahidic Coptic, the literary dialect of early Egyptian Christianity, and it dates to approximately the 4th century CE, though scholars like Frederick Wiese and Alexander Bulig, who produced the standard critical edition, argue that the text it copies is substantially older. Some sections may originate from a 1st or 2nd century source. The word the text uses for what the Archons collect is toins, pneuma. In Greek, that's pneuma, pneuma, usually translated as spirit. But that translation loses almost everything. The original root is the verb neo, to breathe, to blow, to be alive through breath. Pneuma isn't a metaphor for spirit. It's a description of the actual living energetic discharge that accompanies consciousness. The Stoics used the same word to describe what they believed was a fine material substance threading through the entire cosmos. The Gnostics used it specifically to mean the portion of divine light that had become trapped in the human body, and which was being slowly extracted night by night by the archonic structures they described as governing unconscious reality. Now hold that thought. 40 Hz. The gamma oscillation frequency that MIT found passes through the hypnagogic threshold without filtering. In 2008, Joey Jones at UC Irvine published a study mapping the frequency signatures of what practitioners of various contemplative traditions described as intentional presence states during sleep transition. The measurements he recorded from Tibetan dream yoga practitioners who trained specifically to remain aware during the hypnagogic threshold clustered around 39 to 41 Hz. Almost exactly the gamma band that the later MIT research identified as the frequency that bypasses normal neural filtering. The Tibetans called what they were doing milam, dream practice, specifically designed to prevent what their own texts called the theft of awareness during sleep. The theft of awareness. The Gnostics said, Archons collect pneuma from the unguarded sleeper. The Tibetans said, something steals awareness from the unconscious mind during sleep transition. Neuroscience says, there's a 60-second window where your brain's defenses are measurably lowered and it becomes receptive to high-frequency external input. 3 traditions, separated by thousands of miles, describing the same 60-second window, using different words for the same phenomenon. And then there's Jesus. In the Gospel of the Egyptians, in the section scholars call the Hymn of the Great Invisible Spirit, Jesus, referred to there by the Coptic name Yesseus, traceable directly to the Hebrew Yeshua, gives specific instruction about what to do at the moment of sleep onset. Not just to pray, not just to be at peace. He gives a specific utterance, a specific phrase. And he says, in the Coptic text, "Let the one who understands repeat this at the threshold, and the collectors will find nothing to take." The collectors will find nothing to take. If that sentence came from a neuroscience journal, you'd share it, you'd bookmark it, You'd tell people. So why did nobody tell you this came from a text discovered in a clay jar in Upper Egypt in 1945? A text that had been sealed, deliberately hidden, for over 1,600 years? In 367 CE, Athanasius of Alexandria issued what historians call his 39th Festal Letter. It's the first document in Christian history to list the canonical books of the New Testament, the 27 books that make it into the Bible we have today. But it's also something else. The same letter that defined the canon explicitly ordered the destruction of all other texts, texts that Athanasius called apocrypha, hidden things, and which he described as invented by heretics. Monks throughout Egypt were instructed to hand over any manuscripts that didn't appear on his approved list. Some of them didn't comply. Instead, they buried the texts. The Nag Hammadi codices, 13 leather-bound volumes containing 52 separate texts, were found in 1945 by a farmer named Muhammad Ali Saman, who was digging for fertilizer near a cliff face at the base of Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt. He found a sealed red earthenware jar. Inside, the library that Athanasius had tried to erase. It is not a coincidence that the texts that survived describe the Archons in the most operational detail. The texts that made it into the canon describe spiritual enemies in general terms, principalities, powers, rulers of darkness, vague enough to be interpreted as metaphor, vague enough to be managed. The Nag Hammadi texts are not vague. The Gospel of the Egyptians describes the Archons by function. The Apocryphon of John, arguably the most important Gnostic text ever discovered, describes them by name, by domain, by the specific mechanism through which they operate on human consciousness. And it specifically identifies sleep, particularly the unguarded transition into sleep, as the primary extraction window. This isn't theology. This is operational intelligence about something that affects every human being every single night. Who benefits from keeping that operational intelligence out of circulation? Not the divine. The divine doesn't benefit from your ignorance. The divine, in Gnostic cosmology, is the monad, the source that wants you to remember, not forget. The Archons are the structures that require your forgetting. They require your pneuma to be unguarded. They require the threshold to be crossed in unconsciousness. What was buried with Athanasius's letter wasn't heresy. It was the instruction manual for what to do at the moment the Archons have the most access to you. That's what the 39th Festal Letter actually accomplished, not the protection of orthodoxy, the removal of the countermeasure. And here's what they couldn't fully erase: the phrase itself, because it appears not just in the Gospel of the Egyptians, but in 3 separate Nag Hammadi texts: the Gospel of the Egyptians, the 3 Steles of Seth, and the Trimorphic Protonoia, in slightly varying form. 3 separate texts, 3 separate locations in the codices. They buried the library. They couldn't unwrite what was written in 3 places at once. The phrase survived. And now you're about to hear it. In the Gospel of the Egyptians, the phrase appears in the context of what the text calls the seal of the living water, a protective utterance meant to be spoken at the hypnagogic threshold, the moment of sleep onset. The Coptic transliteration, rendered in the standard Bohairic Coptic phonetic system, is Yesseus Mazareus Yessedekeus. Say it again slowly. Yesseus Mazareus Yessedekeus. Scholars debate the etymology. Some, like Gil Kispel, connected the root Yesseus to the Hebrew Yeshua, the name of Jesus. Others have traced Mazareus to a cognate of the Aramaic Mazra, meaning seed or origin point. Yessedekeus contains a root that appears in the Hebrew tzedek, righteousness, alignment, coherence. Together, the phrase has been interpreted as something like the living one, the point of origin, the one who is coherent, not an invocation of an external being, a statement of what you already are. This is exactly consistent with what neuroscience found about the hypnagogic state. The brain at the threshold is highly receptive to pattern input. What you introduce in those 60 seconds, consciously, with intention, enters with almost no filtering resistance. It lands differently than anything you hear during the day. The Gnostics were describing in their framework the same thing the neuroscientists are describing in theirs: a window, a threshold, a moment of maximum receptivity. And the phrase given in the texts is not a request. It's not a prayer in the conventional sense. It's a declaration of identity, something you say to claim your own pneuma before the threshold is crossed in unconsciousness. Yesseus Mazareus Yessedekeus. Here's what you do with it. Tonight, as you feel yourself crossing into sleep, that moment when your body is heavy but your mind is still loosely aware, say the phrase 3 times. Not loudly, not with effort. The way you'd say your own name if someone asked you who you were. Quietly, with certainty. You don't need to understand Coptic. You don't need to understand Gnosticism. The neuroscience of pattern reception during the hypnagogic state doesn't care whether you believe in Archons or not. What you introduce into a maximally receptive brain state during those 60 seconds will land. The monks who buried those jars at Nag Hammadi knew something was worth protecting. 1,600 years later, the jars came back up out of the earth. The texts were hidden. They weren't destroyed. The knowledge was suppressed. It wasn't erased. And now it's yours. Without a priest, without a seminary, without an institution deciding what you're ready to hear. Yesseus Mazareus Yessedekeus. Say it tonight. See what happens to your sleep. See what happens to your dreams. If this changed how you understand what happens to your consciousness every night, the next video goes further. We go into the Apocryphon of John, the most complete Gnostic map of archonic structure ever found, and what it says about the specific moment of waking, the other threshold, and how to cross it with the same intention. That one is going to break something open.